We're good.
You're good?
All right, Mr. Garris. My name's Adam Mast. I'm with Cinemast.net.
I'm Jeff Sanders, same thing. I think it's John and Craig.
Okay. And Mick is fine. Mr. Garris is my dad, and he's no longer with us.
Very well, Mick.
Okay.
Mick. The thing I'd actually like to open up with is about curating horror. I last year came across this awesome YouTube clip that you did. You used to have a horror show where you interviewed like horror directors, and this great interview with John Carpenter, John Landis, and David Cronenberg. I don't know how I mean, like just these titans that are all in there. It was a great interview, really insightful. It was a full hour if I remember right too.
Yeah, it was pretty long.
It was a great interview though, and interesting too because David Cronenberg was like the new kid on the block at the time. And
yeah, definitely.
just seeing like a different perspective and just them early on in their career like that. Great interview. But you've been kind of curating horror for a long time.
Well, I've always been a fan of the genre, and I've always thought there was nothing to be embarrassed about of the genre. I mean, there's a lot of shit in the horror genre, and there's plenty to be embarrassed about. But the genre...
Name any names?
No.
Good man.
But the genre itself is something that I think has some of the greatest work of all in it. You know, some of the greatest film artists certainly have been horror genre directors, whether they continued in that way or not. You know, but as far as the interview show and stuff, when I did the Take One Fear on Film, I was doing publicity at Universal Studios, and they had Videodrome and American Werewolf in London and The Thing all coming out within a year of each other. And I knew both Johns well, and I had done publicity on Scanners before that. Mm-hmm. So the fact that they were all with the same studio, and I had this newly invented job of specializing in genre publicity. Nobody had ever really done that before. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting? I had done magazine interviews and the like, and I had done the Z Channel shows even before that, shortly before that, and thought, wouldn't it be great to get these three guys who nobody knows what horror film directors are like in person. They only know their work, and they might know John Carpenter's name because it was in the title. But what a great idea to get these guys all together and just talk about the genre. Coincidentally, all promoting movies, but not with it feeling like we're selling something. So it was a really good idea that everybody liked at the studio. It cost nothing to do. We got them all together and had a really great freewheeling conversation.
I've got to see that. I actually have not seen that. And I'm going to watch.
Well, I've put together, before that I did a series of like 30 interviews on the Z Channel, which was LA's first pay TV channel. So this was in 1979, 1980, 81, I think. And so I don't have all of those available, but then like 30 years later I did a show for FearNet called Postmortem, and a lot of the same people I interviewed 30 years later, William Friedkin, John Carpenter, people like that. But because I own them all now, and after FearNet went under and they had a window of ownership and the like, I put all of the interviews I have that I could find, including that round table with those guys, all the Z Channel interviews, and the Postmortem interviews are up on a site called MickGarrisInterviews.com. So all of them are available for free, on demand. I don't want your email address. It's just because it's a resource.
Who are some of your favorites currently working in the genre right now?
There's a lot of interesting people working in the genre. It's hard to say who, because I do a lot of traveling around the world to festivals and the like, and I'll see lots of really different things. But putting me on the spot right now, it's hard to say who. But I certainly one of the greatest film artists at work now is Guillermo del Toro. In every sense, he's a genius.
Have you seen Crimson Peak?
I have not seen Crimson
Stephen
Peak.
King has just gone apeshit over that.
That's what I hear, and I'm a huge Guillermo fan. He's a friend. He's actually the guy who, in a roundabout way, named the Masters of Horror as a joke, and. Somebody who can bring a completely original vision in the way that, John Carpenter did, the way that Tobe Hooper did, the way that William Friedkin did. Those are the people who are exciting to watch.
Yeah, and then probably you continued the curating up with Masters of Horror, which you just mentioned, which I was a very big fan of.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. guys like Don Coscarelli. I was
Yeah.
a big fan of too. I thought his Joe Lansdale one was
We were
fantastic.
holding out hope we were going to get
Some Phantasm characters.
stuff because the new film's coming out.
Well, it was so good, that's why we made it the first one that aired.
Yeah.
Everybody was very excited.
Yeah, that was great. Do you think that horror right now is just as good? And do you...
Horror is in a very
80s was
strange-
sort of a heyday, like late 70s, 80s really had this resurgence almost like from, you had your original Frankenstein Universal monsters where it was really hot, and then 50s you had a lot of B-movie stuff that was fun happening, Hammer, horror.
And 70s had a very classic, with the Omen.
Yeah,
and
well,
Exorcist
the Omen and Exorcist and Halloween,
exactly.
and a lot of
It
really
started-
original.
There was
It
a bit of a
started there.
turn in the time, the 80s.
Yeah, the 80s was a renaissance for horror, but to
Yeah.
me, not a creative one. It's, in a way, similar to recent years in horror. All of the slasher movies mostly weren't made by people who loved horror movies and were giving us new visions. That was the beginning of horror franchising with the Friday the 13th and anything that had it's a Thanksgiving Day or whether it's Halloween, New Year's Evil, all those things. But slasher movies, people went to them hoping, and a lot of people in their youth thought that they were great horror movies and try to emulate them now, do 80s flashback kind of slasher movies, but it's in a retro sense. But I do not consider the 80s a golden age of horror. There were great things that happened. The Fly was 86.
And Carpenter was working.
And Carpenter was working.
I think Prince of Darkness is criminally underrated.
Yeah, Carpenter's everything he's ever done is worth seeing. And is really interesting. But most of the independent horror in the 80s was not really of much integrity. I mean, it was a lot of fun, and it was transgressive and bombastic and fun. And a lot of that, this era of filmmaking right now is so completely unable to be put in a box. There are so many ways to get media now, whether it's on television or in theaters or streaming or on your iPad or all kinds of ways of doing it. And because everybody has the tools, even if it's your iPhone or your MacBook but to make them too, anybody can do it. It's very democratic, which is good news and bad news. If everybody can make a movie, that's great for everybody. But if everybody can make a movie, that's not so great for an audience.
Yeah.
It's great because somebody who has a vision who couldn't have afforded to do it 20 years ago maybe can do that now.
Yeah.
But there are horror movies in huge scope. Usually the more expensive a movie is, the less interesting I find it, because the more compromises have to be made. But the more like a single vision you get, It Follows, whether you like it or not, and I think it's a really interesting movie, has a very confident directing style that is not something a studio would endorse.
Well, how about the Babadook?
And Babadook is another film I think is really a great vision from a terrific film artist. I think her work is really good. The kid is amazing. And
Essie Davis also, the gal.
yeah, it's a great movie. So there's really good stuff being made, but there's also, how do you choose from the VOD choices that you go to on iTunes or Vudu or something?
Yeah.
You turn to websites like yours, you turn to, Fangoria or Rue Morgue or all those things, and
The festivals.
Well, we are,
And the
I mean,
festivals.
not at your level maybe, but we're all about curating. We want people to seek out this stuff that's maybe more interesting and not cookie cutter or...
Yeah, well, it's weird. I never volunteered to be the ambassador of horror, but because of Masters of Horror, I get asked a lot of those things. And I'm not a defender of horror. I defend what it's all about, and that there is great work there, and I think it's really good for you. Even the bad stuff is good for you at a certain point. But I've kind of been called upon it because I do travel to festivals and the like, and because I have the interview shows and I'll do roundtable discussions and Q&As like I'm doing with Stuart tomorrow.
Yeah.
That I kind of have become an unwilling and unwitting spokesman for the horror genre, which is something I never intended to do.
But that's what happens to... you love it so much.
I do love it and hate it too. The shit
Yeah.
is shit. But I'm certainly not going to publicly proclaim movies that I don't care for, because, you know, these are people making their careers and trying things out, and, you know, you're going to get better or not, or but everybody deserves that space.
Yeah,
and, you know, my early stuff, there, and all the way through my career, you know, there's been really nasty reviews and great
Critters
reviews.
2 was awesome. I love Critters 2.
Thank you. I'm very proud of Critters 2. It was a total financial disaster that is more popular now than it was in '88 when it
Loved
came
the
out.
first two films tremendously.
Oh, thanks.
But we can't get through this conversation without talking about your relationship with Stephen King.
Especially
Who?
Yeah, exactly. Could you talk a little bit about your relationship? And we'd love to know, you know, I'm sure you love all of his stuff, but maybe do you have a book of his and maybe a big screen adaptation of his stuff that you like, that you
Well,
like
the most exciting thing is that my 3 favorite Stephen King books I've made. You know, The Stand and The Shining here at the Stanley Hotel, and Bag of Bones are 3 of my favorite of his books. But there is one, and I heard it's getting made, but then it was a while ago, and I haven't heard anything. But I love Gerald's Game.
Oh, yeah, it's Mark.
Oh.
No, what's his name? It's the guy that did Oculus
Oh, they're making that.
is making Gerald's
Oh,
Game.
okay, great.
Yeah.
Well,
Mark Flanagan? Is that his
Mike
name?
Mike Flanagan.
Mike Flanagan.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Oculus was terrific.
Yeah. Very good.
Yeah.
And
I think
it's
it
a
was
book, when you read it, you think, how could this possibly be made
Yeah.
into a movie? You know, it's the whole thing is a woman tied naked to a bed
Love
with
that
a
book.
with a dead husband on her who died of a heart attack. But King and I talked about it years ago. I love that book, and I love that you'd have to do something really unique and have a vision to it. And King originally wanted to direct it and have me produce it. And then we talked about me directing it and adapting it. But, you know, it was years and nothing ever came of it, and we got involved in other things. But Stephen King is the most creatively generous human being I've ever met. If you've read his book on writing, you know what it's like being with Stephen King. That book is in such a personal voice. It's like sitting in a room and having him talk with you. It's such a great look at who he is. I don't know if you've read it or not, but the first half of the book was written before the accident that almost killed him. The last half of the book was written afterwards, and the last chapter of the book is called On Living, and it's all about the accident and what happened after. I knew him at the time. It was agonizing. I couldn't reach anybody. I couldn't get any news for months and months about it. And you read that last chapter, even if you don't know him, you will weep. It is so incredibly painful and honest and truthful. That whole book on writing, not just that chapter, is just... Steve is an honest, outgoing person who is the most generous of spirit, and when we're making a movie, he loves to play. It's like a giant train set. He wrote the script for The Shining and for The Stand.
Yeah.
He was here for most of the production of The Shining as a cheerleader. He was also writing The Green Mile at the time, and he'd pump out, you know, a chapter book and give it to me before anybody else had seen it. While after work one day, you know, and I'd be catching up on Green Mile months before it was published.
I'd love to see him direct something again.
I would too.
Maximum Overdrive is the last thing he did.
Well, Maximum Overdrive, he had his issues with. There were lots of them, and not the least of which being it was a Dino De Laurentiis movie with an Italian crew that didn't speak English, and his first time as a director, and all that stuff.
But through the years, we've grown a great appreciation.
Yeah,
It's so much
yeah,
fun.
well,
And the
a
AC/DC
moron movie, as he
as well,
calls it. Yeah, and AC/DC.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, they're wrapping us up. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
No, my pleasure. Thank
You're
you, guys.
amazing, and we
so
will
much.
definitely be at the Stuart Gordon.
Great, yeah.
Wish we could.